Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back to the MineWarp podcast with me, Empie Strydom, and all of my very interesting guests. This is, of course, the podcast where we talk about all things new, innovation, and we talk to innovators and implementers and investors and igniters of new technology that comes to us in the world of mining and heavy industry in general. And that's what our audience find interesting, that we talk to everyone across the board, and as the term goes these days, it's OEM independent. so today we're talking with a very exciting guest. It's someone who's quite literally, how shall I put this, operated at both extremes of the mining world. From 4 kilometers underground to 8 kilometers above sea level. Dr. Jeannette McGill is a mining technologist, or maybe just a technologist in general, but certainly mining, a digital transformation leader, a mountaineer. She actually recently summited Mount Everest. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. And her career spans underground mining operations, telecommunications for mining, and leading innovation in the global mining technology sector. Along the way, she's helped to drive the adoption of digital technologies that actually make mines safer and more connected and more autonomous. So, Jeannette, welcome to the MineWarp podcast.
Thank you so much, Empie. Looking forward to today's conversation.
Yeah, as am I. So, Jeannette, that kind of thumbnail sketch that I gave there paints a very broad picture. But you've got very specific background. You started in mining and then you went from there. So why don't you just tell us a little bit more about your interesting background?
Thank you so much. So my journey started right from sea level, I guess, literally and figuratively, insofar as I grew up in Port Elizabeth. And so
Right.
I started my studies in geology, both at the University of Port Elizabeth as well as Rhodes University. And then it was subsequently that I moved into the Free State and joined the mines there. And it was my experiences there at both Anglo Gold as well as Anglo Val that absolutely shaped the rest of my career, where I have then gone on to do a range of other things. But it was very much from that background, being a geologist, and then I did subsequently continue my studies, a master's from the University of Pretoria, another master's in mineral economics from the Colorado School of Mines, as well as then my capstone being the PhD that I did as well. But it's always been the segue of hands on the ground, hands with the tools, and then being able to augment that with up-to-date learning, and then being able to put everything back into practice again.
That's an interesting last note there, putting stuff back into practice, because you kindly no stranger to learning, clearly no stranger to learning, but at the same time, it can easily become just an academic pursuit and not something practical. But if you stay in the mining world, you've got to make it practical as well. So how did you end up with that background in the digital world?
Well, I guess for me, it's also been an interesting transition from where we were as an industry in the 2000s, I guess, and to how far things have actually come now, and where there's a cohort of us that have really been at the forefront of all those changes that have come along the way. I mean, after my first set of studies, I was working for Anglo Val, and the beauty of the operation that I was on was that we were doing greenfields exploration, we were doing brownfields exploration. There was also old stoping techniques on the western margin, and we were trying to do a new mechanized mine. So the opportunity to go into all of those areas, as see exploration through to mine closure on your very first operation, I think really stood me in very good ground there. And that was where,
Mm-hmm.
we started using modern technologies underground. What happened
Mm.
to me was that I was very curious around how things worked underground. But something as simple as drilling and exploration drilling don't really have those skills as we come through university. And so,
Mm-hmm.
I did a lot of extra work from a drilling perspective. And I'm really to
Okay.
this day indebted to my underground crews that really worked with me and helped me. And they thought I was
Mm.
crazy at the time, but I went down underground the one day and asked my team to show me how to drill a meter of core. And
Mm.
I did that. And just to be
Mm.
able to understand the hydraulic drill rig at that time was experiences that I will never forget. And as
Mm.
a vignette to how I carried that forward, subsequently it was the very beginning of geological modeling and computerized geological models. And
Mm.
so
Mm.
myself and at the time Benford McQuatler, we did a really big piece of work around 3D geological modeling and being able to develop an audit
Mm.
trail that Anglo Gold used at the time for 3D geological
Right.
modeling. The
Yeah.
two of us in tandem actually won an award for the best contribution at that year's Mineral Resource Management Conference. And so once again, that's something in my
Mm.
past
Mm.
which really I draw on, being able to do things that are ahead of the curve, but have also
Mm.
been able to be used subsequently down the line. And then my
Mm.
technology stuff progressed into things like robotic platforms when I was looking after the CSIR. And then
Right.
that's how I actually transitioned into my role in Australia, because I was asked to stand up a line of business for a telecommunications company,
Yeah.
still in the mining sector. And so the common thread there, right from me operating that LM75 drill rig underground all the way through to installing LTE networks, has been the
Mm.
teams of people that I get to work with and support, the learnings I get, but then also being a bit brave and a bit bold
Mm.
about
Mm.
what this technology can do for the sector. And so there's a
Mm.
whole bunch of us who I think entered the sector at a really interesting time where we've literally been able to surf that wave of technology, as
Right.
it were, as things have developed.
Yeah. Um, on that topic of being brave, you you were one of the first technically trained women to work underground in South African mines, weren't you?
Yes, I was. And, I'm really indebted and privileged to have been able to be the very first woman to work on all the shafts that I did
Mm.
underground. Obviously, it didn't come without challenges. And a lot of people actually look at that and go, wow, that seems really strange. And I'll quickly
Mm.
remind the listeners that in South Africa, it was illegal for women to work underground until
Mm.
1997. And so it was only in 1997 that the legislation changed that allowed women to go underground for two reasons. One, they could be health workers to help in the time of a crisis or an accident. Or secondly, women could go underground if they worked a part shift underground. And so this meant that mining engineering wasn't an obvious career path for women in the late
Right, of course.
1990s because we couldn't go and work. However, a
Mm.
lot of women have entered the underground mining space in South Africa via geology, because geologists worked a part shift underground and then you came to
Mm.
surface and then did your
Yes.
mapping and things like that. And that was
Mm.
why when in 2000, when I became the second woman in the Free State to get my underground blasting certificate, there were just so few of us because the opportunities didn't exist. And
Mm.
however, the teams that I worked together with at Target, I was the keen one. I did double shifts. I did a mining shift and a geology shift. But then I got the sufficient shift work to be able to have that experience to go and sit the exam.
Mm.
And it is
Mm.
those formative experiences in my career that I definitely do often think back to.
Just out of interest, as you were talking there, I wondered, did you find any active resistance to, as a woman, going underground when it was, at a time when it wasn't the norm, or was it just like, oh, okay, this is not what we're used to? I mean, was there active resistance?
Yeah, there was at the time, insofar as I really think that on a cultural basis, this was such
Mm,
a new undertaking. I
mm,
was literally once again the first technical woman that worked underground on any of these mines. And we often
mm,
talk around change and the
mm,
impact of change that technology might take in a workplace. But I often say that change is around either through tech or people or process. And in this
mm,
case, I saw change firsthand from a people perspective, because here it was a very new thing to have a woman working underground, insofar as some people didn't really know how to deal with this. I had pushback and challenges from a legitimacy perspective. Do I know sufficient things to work
mm, mm,
underground? And
mm,
it was really interesting challenges that I sort of worked with. I was always somebody that went underground with the perception that whilst I might have studied at university, I will embark on my underground career more as a sponge. And the
okay.
opportunity to be with shift bosses, mine managers, to be able to just talk through mining and really do it from a people-centric perspective. And that is
Yeah.
why the time that I spent with my career with the teams and the crews was absolutely so formative. But I think that I definitely had pushback, and I had opportunities where I just had to be the bigger person. I sometimes had to stay quieter, and I was never somebody that was just going to absolutely push my way through
Mm.
doors, but there were definitely ceilings that I couldn't at that stage break through. But
Yeah.
I also understand where the entire sector was at that stage. And I'm
At the
really
time.
glad now
Yeah.
to see the opportunities that have opened up for women in the
Mm,
mining sector, and of course in the underground mining sector. And also, I think the South African mining sector should be exceptionally proud, because if you do look at the numbers, how long it took places like Canada and Australia, they allowed women to work underground from the 1970s, and South
mm,
Africa only allowed it, as I said, from 1997. So that's a good 20-year gap. But where South
mm,
Africa has got to in a very short space of time puts them on a par with Australia and Canada. And I think that is where South Africa should be exceptionally proud of the change that happened, but also, allowing us women to
mm,
to join, because we have then been able to contribute. We see things slightly different, and we bring that diversity of thought into the
mm.
boardroom or in the waiting place as well.
It's I recently read an article about Africa, and the topic, I should say, the clickbait was, you know, how bad is Africa? And the speaker then, or the writer, he started talking about, the high birth rate and the high infant mortality rate and the low earnings and the low access to internet and the low access to electricity. And he started mentioning this, incredible amount of things going badly in Africa, or in a bad state in Africa. And then he said, so what do we do? Do we just give up? Is it just, I guess this is just the way that Africa is. And then he said, but hang on, there's another perspective. He said, let's look at some of the most developed countries, and we ask ourselves, how long did it take, say, for example, a country like Sweden, you know, to go from pre-industrialized to industrialized? How long did it take a country like the UK to halve their infant mortality rate and their and mothers dying during birth and so on? And he started comparing the accelerated catch up of Africa as compared to the rest of the world. And all of a sudden, it's a much different picture, and a very hopeful picture that you're looking at. And I think so it's important to have those, the pioneers like what you've done, but also, or like what you are, but also to take the perspective of, just because it might be bad now, it doesn't mean it's going to be bad forever, and it doesn't have to take forever to become different either. You know?
Absolutely. You've got to look at these
Yeah.
things holistically, and that's why, I do bang on a little bit around the history of women in mining
Mm,
in South Africa, because I think as a whole, like you're alluding to as well, we can be very proud of what the sector has achieved.
Mm, mm. So your legacy in communications, or let's call it the last mile communications, or getting the information to and from the stope, the worker who is actually doing the work in there. You really believe that connectivity is an enabler, right? And so my question is, what do mining companies misunderstand, do you think, about digital infrastructure as an enabler for better mining?
It's about being able to have a very clear plan ahead of time. I think the challenge we have with a lot of tech that goes into the mines is that it effectively looks a bit like a spider's web. And of course, that's going to happen
Okay.
because of the reiterative cycles we have in the new
Mm,
technology. But I think very much from a connectivity perspective, we need to be bold and brave to be able to go, this is the system we want to put in place. And sometimes that
mm,
means removing things that are exactly there that have been used previously. But the
mm,
upside being able to put in these systems is significant, especially with the
mm,
ability now to use cellular communication in some underground places, and that
mhm,
be able to have a far more robust communications and data connectivity. And with the
mm.
data connectivity allows that much more efficient operations to take place.
You did a lot of thinking around that in your role at Telstra, didn't you?
Yes, my Telstra opportunity was a really intriguing one.
Mm,
A lot of people say it was very brave of me. When transitions roles, people tend to either stay in the same swim lane but move
uh-huh.
countries, and
Yeah.
sometimes people will stay in the same country but then go into a different lane, as it were. I did both
Yeah.
simultaneously. I had an opportunity to relocate to Australia, but then also shift swim lanes from
Mm,
pure mining, where I had previously been leading technology for Anglo Platinum, into the
yeah.
adjacent swim lane of telecommunications. And what the business challenge was there is that, the really good, strong cellular network providers provide really good, reliable networks for the police, fire, and ambulance. And that
Mm-hmm.
public service is obviously given to the police, fire, and ambulance for free. And that is why those service providers can always make a phone call on, say,
Yeah.
New Year's Eve when the rest of us can't. And so the mining companies looked at this and said, we would really like access to that best-in-class quality network. We get
Mm,
it. It can go free to police, fire, and ambulance, but we would like to be able to pay for this technology. And so it was
mm,
nothing new that Telstra was servicing into the carpeted office spaces. And
mm.
what was going to be new was taking that last mile connectivity into
Yeah.
the operating pits and operating spaces. Traditionally, that
Mm,
had always been serviced by wireless and Wi-Fi networks.
mm. Yep.
What they now wanted was access to this best-in-breed, reliable network that Telstra could provide because of the advent of automation. And you can appreciate the overarching risk that if a truck falls off a network whilst it's being operated some 600 kilometers away in an airport precinct, when the actual
Mm,
vehicle is, miles and kilometers away, there's a very
mm,
big risk loading there. And so that's when we started developing these in-mine communication networks with a
mm,
range of hardware providers as well, and being able to ideate, being able to work with solutions providers and engineers to really be at the cutting edge of putting out what would become this first connectivity, which is now duplicated and replicated by a range of other service providers as well. Whilst I was at Mining Indaba this year, I did listen to a panel interview where some of the other industry people were talking about what they were doing in Africa. And that's very
mm,
much on a lot on what we sort of did our cutting edge development with. And I'm also very proud to have a team where we stood up the first LTE network in Papua New Guinea as well. And so
mm,
to be able to take something which was conceptual and being
mm,
able to then work in tandem with both mining companies as well as with service providers from a hardware perspective and put a robust communications network in place has really been able to enable this next wave of autonomy and, digital mining that has been able to take
mm.
place. And it's a huge honor to have been involved with that.
Yeah. Sorry for looking around. I'm just seeing a courier outside, but I did tell my son. So okay, now we'll carry on there. The thing that I always think of when I see communication becoming an issue is data communication is a big thing when it comes to operating technology and tracking progress of machines and equipment and production. But it is also very much a safety thing. And so I would imagine that implementing the specifically connectivity is a big safety driver as well. Not imagine, I know this, but you know, you know all about summit fever when it comes to mountaineering, and there's a little bit of a similar kind of thing there when I can track my production and I can see how close I'm getting to where I've got to be. Um, then sometimes it's a let's drive at any cost to make this production target. Do you think the fact that there's a greater visibility of what goes on and a continuous visibility of what goes on kind of works against that ethos? Is it more standard? Is it more clear? Is it more structured now? And that helps for safety?
I do think that greater visibility does result in greater safety. It's just simply
Mm,
that we can then have a greater degree of what are some of those leading indicators. With large events, it's always easy to do a back end review. But
yeah.
as all great things, you can understand that unfortunate incidents are largely the result of, some specific risk points accumulating.
Mm,
And I do
mm,
think that the ability to just have greater visibility and the data can allow us to have bigger visibility of these leading indicators. But the
mm,
opposite is true as well. We shouldn't just have, as you call it, summit fever around
mm,
technology and deploy technology for
mm.
technology's sake. I think a lot of the
Right.
work that I do in conversation with people is around the applicability of technology. It's around having an underlying vision and purpose for that technology. And you
Mm,
don't necessarily have to jump on the tech bandwagon. So understand what safety you are able to support through tech, but at the
mm,
same time, deploy what is appropriate for the specific operating environment.
mm, mm. I want to come back to just to this comment that you made about when you moved to Australia. The changing the swim lanes there a little bit, going into a different career lane as well. This is something that we often see in mining. That there is um, this standing question. Does top management have to come from a mining background, or can we bring in outsiders? And what contributes best to adopting new thinking and not getting stuck in just the way that we do it, as opposed to, well, we've actually got to know the way that we do it if we want to improve. What are your feelings about that?
One of these areas which has definitely had different paradigms as the mining sector has progressed.
Mm,
Previously it was exceptionally mining centric, and then we'll all recall the wave where a lot of the senior leaders were coming from adjacencies, especially in manufacturing, more specifically car
mm,
manufacturing. There was a
mm,
phase of senior executives came from that. And so we'll probably continue seeing this flux.
mm,
Oftentimes people will say that mining isn't as difficult as miners like to make out, but I do think that that's a bit of a flippant statement. And so far as I've always seen the value of being able to come into a mining space with my
mm,
mining knowledge, because I
mm,
know exactly what it's like underground. I know exactly what it's like to deploy, and I've been
mm,
able to be at the forefront of exactly how we'd start doing this work. So I believe that
mm,
in the mining sector, it is very important for there to be some people that understand the mining practice from either geological perspective, a mining engineering perspective, who've actually had that time, because that's where you can adequately, look at technology integration as well as operational risk together, because together those things will materially affect enterprise risk. And to have people that can understand all of that, I think, is definitely a plus in terms of value add for organizations. So I have seen the pendulum shift a bit more to more mining centric abilities as well.
And I guess this is also true both now from a understanding mining and an understanding technology perspective. When it comes to the senior people who sit on companies' boards, because sometimes you find that there's a push for adopting new processes, new thinking, even new technologies, and so on, from the senior heads of department and so on the mine. But there might be a lack of understanding of the real value that can be unlocked at a board level, and so now that introduces tension. Now you are on a few boards at the moment, and you've kind of transitioned into an interesting role that you play for companies there. How do you see, the level of readiness of people on boards in general now, to deal with what the modern company demands of them?
It's a fantastic conversation question you have there, Empie. And for me, it really talks to what type of boards are being used to lead some of the companies. Is it a very much a governance-centric board, or is it a strategic board? And I think at different phases of companies' life cycles, there is a need to have one or the other. And a company can also transition from a more governance-centric board to one that has a larger strategic intent as well. And I do think then that conversation on a strategic board is the opportunity to be able to look past just the operational oversight of technology, which of course remains the domain for the senior operational team on the mine. But I think from a board level, it's really important to be able to have these conversations around the appropriate decision making. How do we know we are putting in the right technology for the right reason? Besides the decision making, there's also the value add conversation. It's around understanding, what is the true value to the mine, and also forward looking of deploying different types of technology and being able to have that conversation. And so being able to do the scenario analysis and the trade-offs with a board level approach to the deployment of these technologies. I do think that there is definite scope to be able to have deeper dives in the role of that tech conversation as it plays out with the operational risk at play, because at the end of the day, boards have to have that conversation around risk, but let's also understand the operational risk in the context of technology deployments.
Yeah. No, that's really good, and I'm thinking also that it actually puts a different demand on the makeup of the board, in the sense that it might be that we don't only need highly experienced business people there, but we also need some technically minded people in there. And now I'm not only referring to digital technology, but what's the best new way to approach mining? Should we go electrification here? Should we not? Because sometimes that's an engineering heavy decision. Sometimes that's a portfolio decision. Let's test something here and see whether it's good to adopt at the other mines. And so, the role of the board member, I can see, is just becoming greater and greater.
I think there's also scope not only for a board member per se on the daily cadence or the weekly cadence of board meetings, but also the opportunity for boards to, in their strategy conversations, to bring in thought leaders and being able to have deep dives around technology. So if it is not part of the board meeting cadence, at least to incorporate some really deep consideration and qualified thinking from these deeper strategy sessions. There's absolute value to that as well.
Yeah. So we're very, very quickly running out of time. I think we have already, but this conversation is so interesting. Um, I normally transition back a little bit to a more personal level here at the end of the podcast. And I typically ask people, so what do you do for fun? I don't know whether that's the right question to ask of someone who's a high mountain mountaineer, you know, because I know from the little bit of experience that I have in that world that it's not always fun, but it's always fun to look back and see what you've done. So tell us a little bit more about your mountaineering background, if you wouldn't mind spending the last few minutes on that.
Sure, happy to. And yes, most people who know me have known that my time has always effectively been spent either in mining or in the mountains. And it's been a passion of mine that's come right from my early days growing up in the Eastern Cape and doing
Hmm.
some rugged things there. But yes, mountaineering in the mountains is a bit like running. Running, you can
Hmm.
have 100 meters or trail running or marathons or cross country. And equally in mountaineering, you've got a range of disciplines. And the
Mm.
area that I've really become passionate about and really enjoy is high altitude mountaineering. I
Mm.
got there largely out of a scientific experiment with myself. Not many
Okay.
people physiologically know if you can get to 8,000 meters above sea level into these
Mm.
ultra high altitudes. You just don't know if your body's going to be able to survive at that altitude.
Mm.
And so my journey was quite a sequential one, first dabbling with 6,000-meter mountains and then 7,000-meter mountains. And then, yes, I embarked on my first 8,000-meter mountain expedition. And it was to understand, can my body actually get to these extreme altitudes, which thankfully it
Mm.
did. And then
Mm.
I've gone on to climb a couple of other 8,000-meter mountains. I've been always very proud to raise the South African flag on the summits that I've been to, and also help other people on that journey is
Mm.
something that I do. But yes, at the outset, it was never, am I going to do Everest? It was more a mountaineering journey and an
Right.
experiential thing. But then after COVID, it was largely COVID where everybody went back outdoors after COVID.
Mm.
And I wasn't
Mm.
dissimilar to that. And that's when I decided, you know what? Let me give this animal a bit of a try, and very grateful to have planned a very specific sabbatical to be able
Mm.
to take the time out to train, to focus on this life goal of mine. And yes, exceptionally honored and happy. The
Mm.
monkey has climbed off my back insofar as I was able to summit Everest in May of
Yeah.
last year. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm now 9 months post my Everest summit, and
Mm-hmm.
really enjoying feeling a little bit lighter. I do feel like that goal has lessened, and
Right.
being able to think back to some of the things that I learned along the way, but also more importantly, jump back into the mining sector again. So mountaineering is something that's been with me my entire trajectory. Being in the
Mm.
outdoors is how I tend to solve my challenges, the
Okay.
leadership problems. You go in for a nice, good long walk, and a lot of solutions start appearing for themselves. So therefore,
Mm.
this hasn't a tick in the box and I'll leave it. It's something which I will always undertake. But right now, I'm also really loving stepping back and reconnecting with people
Mm.
in the
Mm.
mining network as well.
And you do some talks about um, the lessons you've learned, right, from I should say that, as you called it previously, the 30-year journey, that it took you to get to the summit of Everest. It's a similar kind of developmental approach to leadership, and hold on approach to leadership that you promote. Am I right?
Yeah, I'm very encouraged by the audience response to the
Mm.
presentation that I have given to a couple of organizations. One being, I spoke with the GSSA and the SAIMM during Mining Indaba. The amount of people that were able to come to a Tuesday morning
Mm.
presentation adjacent to the Mining Indaba, I was really touched by the standing room only audience that
Mm.
I had.
Mm.
And really, what I'm bringing to the fore there is this notion that, there's always these things that we decide that we're going to get to someday,
Mm.
one day we'll get around to doing something when the kids are grown up or the job has calmed down
Yeah.
a little bit. And it's really around, for me, Everest was sort of maybe a someday thing. I had heard of it and I had thought about it way back 30 years previously, as you quite rightly say. But it was always a someday project. And eventually I took that someday project and I started with day one. And I encourage other people, all of us at this stage of our careers, to be able to not forget those things that we've had tapping us on the shoulder when our birthday occurs or something. And it's not about going, I'm going to do this big meaty thing like climb a mountain. It's simply beginning. There was somebody who came to me after one of my talks and was so happy that she'd always wanted to write a book. And she said to me after my talk, she actually just sat down and wrote half a page of words. And the next day she wrote half a page of words. And that's exactly it. It's around not, worrying about the big audacious goals so much as just the consistency of starting these things. And so I encourage everybody to just start the same way I just started walking around the block on my Everest journey.
Jeannette, thank you so much for your inspiration there, and thank you also for sharing some wisdom there. I think across the board, from the miner in the mine to the board member, you've walked in all of those shoes, and it was great to have your perspectives. And all the best with the new ventures that you're going to be taking on. I trust that the future will hold even equally exciting and equally meaningful roles for you.
Thank you so much, Empie. I appreciate it.